Ethan Ward had built an empire in the city, but all his victories felt hollow compared to the sound of her laughter echoing down the hallway of their shared home. For years he had hidden it, his heart's betrayal, but friendship was no longer enough. The boardroom erupted in applause as Ethan Ward closed another $1 million deal, his marketing firm securing yet another Fortune 500 client that would cement his reputation as one of the city's most brilliant strategists. At 28, he commanded respect from competitors twice his age, owned a penthouse that graced architectural magazines, and possessed the kind of success that made other men envious of his seemingly perfect existence. But as he stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, accepting congratulations from his senior partners, Ethan's mind was already racing toward 6 o'clock, toward the moment he could escape this world of corporate victories and return to the only person who had ever made his achievements feel meaningful. Lily Summers had no idea that she was the secret driving force behind every ambitious decision he had ever made. She didn't know that her casual mention of wanting to live in the city had inspired his relentless pursuit of success, or that every late night at the office was motivated by his desire to build something worthy of the woman who had unknowingly owned his heart since their junior year of high school. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest triumph and his most exquisite torture were the same person. Lily believed their bond was simply unshakable friendship, the kind of platonic devotion that survived high school drama, college separations, and the inevitable changes that transformed teenagers into adults. She spoke about their connection with such easy affection, such comfortable certainty, that Ethan had learned to mirror her casual warmth, while his pulse betrayed him with every smile she sent his way. 10 years of loving her in silence, of perfecting the art of being her best friend, while his heart hammered against his ribs whenever she walked into a room. 10 years of watching her date other men, of offering comfort when relationships failed, of celebrating her successes, and supporting her dreams while carefully concealing the fact that she was his dream, the only one that mattered. His phone buzzed with a text message that made his chest tighten with familiar anticipation. How did the big presentation go? I'm making celebration dinner just in case. Your favorite pasta with way too much garlic bread. Can't wait to hear everything. The warmth in her words, the way she remembered details about his work life, her assumption that he would want to share his victories with her. It all hit him with the devastating force he had never learned to resist. She cared about him, genuinely and deeply, but with the uncomplicated affection of someone who had never questioned whether friendship was enough. Ethan typed back quickly. Deal closed. Home in an hour. Thank you for believing it would go well. He almost added more, almost let his fingers type the words that crowded his throat, that her faith in him meant more than any client contract, that coming home to her felt like the real victory, that he had spent 10 years pretending friendship was sufficient when she was the reason he understood what love actually meant. Instead, he deleted the message and sent the safer version, the one that maintained the careful boundaries he had, constructed to protect both of them from the truth that consumed him more completely, with every passing year. The drive home took him through the city he had conquered in her honor, past buildings where his advertisements commanded premium placement, through streets where his professional reputation preceded him like a calling card. But as he pulled into the driveway of the townhouse they had agreed to share, her suggestion, his secret prayer answered. None of his external success mattered compared to the light glowing in their kitchen window. Lily appeared in the doorway before he could finish climbing the front steps, her face bright with curiosity and celebration. She wore a simple blue dress that made her eyes look like summer storms. Her dark hair caught in the casual updo that drove him to distraction because it exposed the graceful line of her neck. When she smiled at him with genuine excitement about his professional triumph, Ethan felt his throat go dry, and his carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble. She hugged him in greeting, the same friendly embrace she had given him countless times over the years, but his body responded with the familiar rush of heat that made him grateful for the business suit that concealed his racing pulse, the scent of her perfume, something light and floral that he could identify in a crowded room, filled his senses, and reminded him why coming home felt like both salvation and sweet torture. Over dinner, she peppered him with questions about the presentation, her interest so genuine and engaged that he found himself sharing details he had never discussed with anyone else. She listened with the kind of focused attention that made him feel like the most important person in her world, her eyes bright with pride for his success, her excitement infectious enough to make him temporarily forget that her affection was safely contained within the boundaries of friendship. This was his life. Moments of perfect contentment interrupted by the constant ache of wanting more, of loving someone so completely that her happiness became his primary concern, even when it meant suppressing his own desires. Lily was his best friend, his closest confidant, the person who knew him better than anyone else in the world, except for the one crucial truth he could never risk revealing, because losing her friendship would destroy him more completely than any business failure or professional setback ever could. Better to love her in silence, to cherish the connection they shared, than to risk everything on the possibility that she might feel something deeper for him than the comfortable affection she had always shown. How long can a man cage a love that grows stronger every year? The townhouse had been Lily's discovery. A charming 3-bedroom Victorian tucked between trendy cafes and vintage bookshops in the kind of neighborhood that attracted young professionals with artistic sensibilities and healthy bank accounts. She had called Ethan during his lunch meeting with portfolio investors, her voice bubbling with excitement as she described hardwood floors, bay windows, and a kitchen that opened onto a small garden where she could grow herbs for cooking. For her, the decision to share the space was purely practical, splitting rent on their dream location, while maintaining the easy companionship that had anchored both their lives since high school. She presented the arrangement with characteristic enthusiasm, listing all the logical benefits: lower housing costs, built-in security, someone to water plants during business trips, and the continued friendship that had survived every major life transition they had navigated. For Ethan, her proposal felt like the answer to prayers he had been too afraid to voice. 10 years of carefully maintained distance, of seeing her only during planned dinners or group gatherings, of missing the everyday moments that composed a life. Suddenly, she was offering him proximity he had never dared to request. The chance to share morning coffee, to witness her sleepy confusion before she fully woke up, to exist in the same space where her presence would transform his daily routines from mundane necessities into opportunities for contentment. He accepted with what he hoped sounded like casual enthusiasm, matching her practical tone while his heart hammered with anticipation that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Living with Lily would be heaven and hell, combined. The intimacy he had always craved paired with the exquisite torture of maintaining his carefully constructed facade in circumstances that would test every defense mechanism he had spent years perfecting. Moving day arrived with October sunshine that turned the neighborhood's maple trees into flames of orange and gold, the kind of perfect autumn weather that made new beginnings feel possible and magical. Lily orchestrated the process with military precision, directing the movers while simultaneously unpacking boxes and arranging furniture with the focused energy that had made her one of the city's most sought-after elementary school teachers. Ethan found himself mesmerized by her efficiency, the way she moved through the spaces with confident purpose, claiming corners and arranging belongings with an innate sense of homemaking that transformed the empty rooms into something warm and inviting. She hummed while she worked, unconscious melodies that floated through the house like a soundtrack to their new life together, and he caught himself pausing in his own unpacking just to listen to the sound of her contentment. By evening, they had created something unprecedented in his adult life, a shared space that felt genuinely like home, rather than simply a place to sleep between professional obligations. Lily had insisted on cooking their first dinner together, claiming it was essential to properly christen their kitchen, and Ethan had watched her navigate the unfamiliar appliances with the adaptability that had always amazed him about her approach to life's challenges. They ate by candlelight, not for romance, but because they hadn't yet figured out how to operate the dining room's antique light fixture, and Lily laughed at their domestic incompetence with such genuine amusement that Ethan felt his chest expand with happiness so pure it almost hurt. This was what he had imagined during every lonely evening in his previous apartment, sharing meals and conversation with the woman who made even the most ordinary moments feel significant. That night, lying in his new bedroom just down the hall from hers, Ethan listened to the unfamiliar sounds of cohabitation. Water running through old pipes, the creak of floorboards as she moved through her bedtime routine, the soft click of her lamp being turned off. For the first time in 10 years, falling asleep felt like victory rather than defeat. Because tomorrow he would wake up in the same house as Lily, and the day after that, and every day for as long as their arrangement continued. But victory came with its own complications. The proximity he had dreamed of brought challenges he had never fully anticipated. The casual intimacy of shared domestic space, the way their lives would interweave in mundane but devastating ways, the constant temptation to let his guard down when her presence became as natural as breathing. Within a week, their routines had synchronized with an ease that felt both natural and dangerous. Lily was an early riser who claimed the kitchen for her morning tea and newspaper ritual, humming softly while she planned her day and packed lunch for her elementary school students. Ethan had always been disciplined about his morning workout, but now he found himself timing his return from the gym to coincide with her breakfast routine, telling himself it was efficiency, while knowing it was simply his need to see her sleepy smile and hear her voice before facing his corporate battles. She cooked dinner most evenings, claiming it relaxed her after dealing with 25 6-year-olds, and Ethan contributed wine and conversation while trying not to stare at the way. Domestic tasks transformed her into someone even more beautiful than the polished professional woman who attended dinner parties and gallery openings. There was something achingly intimate about watching her taste pasta sauce and adjust seasonings, about the unconscious grace with which she moved through their shared kitchen, about the way she automatically set two places at their small dining table as if his presence was simply an assumed part of her evening routine. What happens when the woman you love unknowingly becomes your every waking moment? Living with Lily was like existing in a state of constant, exquisite awareness. Every sense hypertuned to her presence. Every ordinary moment transformed into something that registered in his nervous system with devastating clarity. Ethan had imagined that proximity would eventually dull the intensity of his response to her. That familiarity would breed the kind of comfortable indifference that characterized most roommate arrangements. Instead, the opposite proved true. Daily exposure to her unguarded self only intensified his devotion, revealing layers of her personality that formal dates and group gatherings had never allowed him to witness. He discovered that she sang in the shower, her voice carrying through their shared wall with unconscious joy that made him pause whatever task had been occupying his attention. He learned that she read mystery novels late into the night, her bedside lamp creating a warm glow beneath her bedroom door that he could see from his own room when insomnia kept him awake with thoughts of her, sleeping just steps away. Most torturous were the moments when their domestic routines intersected in ways that felt almost deliberately, designed to test his emotional endurance. Mornings when she emerged from her bedroom in silk pajamas and bare feet, her hair tousled from sleep and her eyes still soft with dreams, padding to the kitchen for coffee while he pretended to review marketing reports at their dining table. The sight of her moving through their shared space with such natural intimacy, the way she hummed while waiting for water to boil, the unconscious grace of her movements as she reached for mugs in the cabinet he had arranged specifically to accommodate her height, left him breathless with wanting. Evenings were equally challenging, particularly when she settled onto their couch for her nightly reading ritual, curling into the corner cushions with a book and a cup of herbal tea that filled their living room with the scent of chamomile and honey. She read with complete absorption, occasionally laughing at something amusing or making small sounds of surprise that drew his attention from whatever work he was pretending to focus on at the nearby desk. Sometimes she would glance up to share a particularly interesting passage or ask his opinion about a plot development, and her eyes would meet his with such trusting intimacy that his throat would close with the effort of maintaining casual conversation. The kitchen became his greatest source of both joy and agony, transformed from a functional space into a theater where Lily performed unconscious acts of domestic poetry that left him dizzy with love and frustration. She cooked with the same focused creativity she brought to her classroom teaching, tasting and adjusting seasonings while humming melodies that seemed to emerge from some deeper contentment he had helped create simply by sharing her daily life. But it was her hair that nearly undid him, completely the way it caught morning. Sunlight when she sat at their breakfast table, The silk dark curtain that fell across her face when she leaned over books or papers, the casual intimacy of watching her twisted into evening updos that exposed the vulnerable nape of her neck. He memorized every shade from chocolate to auburn that appeared depending on lighting and season, catalogued every gesture she used to push it behind her ears when concentration demanded clearer vision, and felt his pulse accelerate whenever stray strands brushed against his hand. During their increasingly frequent but carefully casual physical contact, touch became both necessity and torture in their shared domestic space. Passing each other in their narrow hallway required brief contact that registered in his nervous system like electrical current. Her hand on his shoulder for balance, his palm against her back as he guided her through doorways, the brush of fingers when they reached for the same cabinet or shared serving utensils during dinner preparation. She initiated these moments with the unconscious ease of someone who had never questioned the safety of their physical friendship, while he experienced each brief contact as evidence of an intimacy that existed only in his imagination. Weekends were particularly challenging because they disrupted the protective routine of professional obligations that normally provided structure for his emotional discipline. Saturday mornings found them both home without the buffer of work schedules, sharing breakfast and newspaper sections while she planned weekend errands, and he struggled to focus on anything beyond her presence across their small dining table. She would lean forward to point out interesting articles or ask his opinion about local events, her face animated with the kind of engaged curiosity that had first captured his attention in high school. And he would find himself agreeing to activities, art gallery visits, farmers market trips, evening concerts that prolonged their time, together while testing his ability to maintain the facade of platonic friendship. Sunday evenings were the worst, because they carried the melancholy awareness that another week of shared domesticity was ending, that Monday would return them to separate professional worlds, where their contact would be limited to text messages and brief phone calls. Lily seemed to feel this transition too, becoming quieter as weekend freedom gave way to the responsibilities of the coming week, and her subdued mood triggered protective instincts that he could barely contain within appropriate boundaries. He found himself creating reasons to extend their Sunday evening conversations, asking questions about her upcoming school projects, or sharing details about his marketing campaigns that he would normally keep confidential. Anything to postpone the moment when she would retreat to her bedroom, and he would be left alone with the constant ache of loving someone who remained beautifully, devastatingly unaware of the effect she had on his entire existence. Love in silence can be the sweetest, and the cruelest, prison. David Chen arrived in Lily's life with the timing of a natural disaster, appearing at precisely the moment when Ethan had begun to believe that their domestic equilibrium might be sustainable indefinitely. The introduction came through Lily's enthusiastic description of her school's new art teacher, a man whose credentials included a fine arts degree from Columbia, and enough charm to make the entire elementary school faculty develop collective crushes within his first week of employment. Ethan listened to her initial reports with the polite interest he had cultivated for discussions of her professional world, filing away details about David's innovative teaching methods and artistic background, while assuming he would remain a peripheral figure in their shared existence. But as days turned into weeks, David's presence in Lily's conversation became increasingly frequent and detailed, his name appearing in her daily stories with the kind of casual familiarity that triggered alarms in Ethan's carefully controlled emotional landscape. The first real threat came disguised as an innocent invitation. Lily mentioned over dinner that David had asked her to attend a gallery opening featuring local artists, and she was considering accepting because the exhibition sounded interesting, and she rarely ventured into the city's art scene without professional obligations requiring her presence. She spoke about the potential evening with characteristic thoughtfulness, weighing the social benefits against her natural tendency toward introversion, seeking Ethan's opinion about whether such events were worth the energy investment. Her casual request for advice hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to provide encouraging responses while jealousy clawed through his chest with vicious intensity. She trusted his judgment about her social life, valued his perspective on decisions both significant and mundane, but she had no idea that recommending she spend an evening with another man felt like performing emotional surgery on himself without anesthesia. He managed appropriate enthusiasm for her, potential cultural enrichment while internally cataloging everything he knew about David Chen from Lily's innocent descriptions. Divorced, 31 years old, recently relocated from San Francisco to pursue a career change that prioritized creative fulfillment over financial advancement. Someone who had chosen passion over security, who possessed the kind of artistic sensibility that Lily found intellectually stimulating, who could offer her experiences that Ethan's corporate world never provided. The gallery opening proved to be the beginning of a campaign that David pursued with the focused determination of someone who recognized Lily's extraordinary qualities and intended to claim them before other men realized what was available. He possessed natural advantages that Ethan could never compete against: artistic sensitivity, creative passion, the kind of bohemian lifestyle that contrasted appealingly with her structured teaching routine. More dangerously, he was available, unmarried, free to pursue romantic involvement without the complex emotional history that had shaped every interaction between Ethan and Lily for the past decade. David's courtship was subtle, but persistent, disguised as professional collaboration and cultural education, but clearly designed to insert himself into increasingly intimate areas of Lily's life. He recommended books that aligned with her interests, invited her to poetry readings and independent film screenings, shared knowledge about art and literature that expanded her intellectual horizons in ways that made her eyes brighten with discovery and appreciation. Ethan watched this progression with the helpless fury of someone witnessing a carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Every evening brought fresh reports of David's thoughtfulness: flowers left on her classroom desk, handwritten notes accompanying book recommendations, invitations to cultural events that demonstrated his understanding of her aesthetic preferences. Lily shared these details with the innocent excitement of someone experiencing romance for the first time in months, her voice carrying a warmth that had never been directed toward Ethan, despite 10 years of devoted friendship. The transformation in her was subtle but unmistakable. She began paying more attention to her appearance, choosing outfits with greater care, and experimenting with hairstyles that enhanced her natural beauty. She started staying after school for conversations with David that extended their professional collaboration into personal territory, arriving home later than usual with stories about their discussions of art, literature, and educational philosophy that revealed growing intellectual intimacy. Most devastating was the way she began questioning her own social patterns, wondering aloud whether she had become too comfortable with routine, too dependent on familiar relationships, too hesitant about embracing new experiences that might enrich her life in unexpected ways. Her self-reflection carried no criticism of their friendship, no suggestion that she found their domestic arrangement unsatisfying, but Ethan recognized the subtext. David was awakening possibilities she hadn't previously considered, making her aware of aspects of herself that their decade-long relationship had apparently never explored. The first time she canceled their traditional Friday evening dinner to attend a concert with David, Ethan experienced jealousy with such volcanic intensity that he had to leave their townhouse and walk through the city for hours before trusting himself to return home. She had apologized sweetly for the change in plans, clearly unaware that their weekly ritual meant more to him than any professional obligation or social commitment, and her innocent regret about missing their time together only intensified his awareness of everything he stood to lose. He returned to find a note she had left on their kitchen counter, thanking him for being understanding about her last-minute schedule change, and promising to make their postponed dinner extra special the following week. The casual affection in her handwriting, the assumption that their friendship was secure enough to weather occasional disruptions, the complete absence of any awareness that she was slowly breaking his heart. It all combined to create an emotional storm that kept him awake until she returned home, her key in the lock announcing her safe arrival while he lay in his bedroom pretending to sleep. What is stronger, friendship, or the instinct to fight for the one who owns your soul? The first crack appeared during a Saturday morning in November, when Ethan descended to their kitchen to find Lily preparing breakfast with unusual attention to presentation. Fresh flowers on the table, perfectly arranged fruit, coffee served in their good china rather than the casual mugs they normally used for weekend mornings. She hummed while she worked, a melody he didn't recognize, and her entire demeanor carried the kind of anticipatory energy that suggested special occasion or celebration. She explained with characteristic enthusiasm that David was joining them for brunch, her first invitation for him to visit their shared domestic space. and she wanted everything to feel welcoming and thoughtfully prepared. Her excitement about introducing him to their home environment, about sharing the comfortable intimacy of their weekend routines with someone new, triggered something primal and possessive in Ethan's carefully controlled emotional landscape. David arrived precisely on time, bearing artisanal pastries and single-origin coffee beans that demonstrated both thoughtfulness and sophistication. He moved through their home with the confident ease of someone accustomed to making positive impressions, complimenting Lily's decorating choices while engaging Ethan in conversation that revealed impressive knowledge of marketing trends and business strategy. His charm was effortless, his interest in their domestic arrangement apparently genuine, and his obvious appreciation for Lily's company unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Watching them interact in his territory, their kitchen, their dining table, their carefully cultivated domestic sanctuary, Ethan experienced jealousy so intense it felt like physical illness. David's casual touches, the way he helped clear dishes and navigate unfamiliar cabinet arrangements, his comfortable laughter at Lily's stories about their early cohabitation disasters, it all suggested an intimacy that was progressing faster than Ethan had anticipated or prepared himself to witness. But more disturbing were the changes in his own behavior that began surfacing during that interminable brunch. He found himself positioning his chair closer to Lily's than strictly necessary, his shoulder brushing hers when he reached for serving utensils, his attention more focused on her responses to David's conversation than on the actual topics being discussed. When she laughed at David's witty observations, Ethan caught himself manufacturing similar humor, competing for her attention in ways that felt both desperate and transparent. His voice, when he spoke directly to her, carried a softer quality than he used in their normal conversation, an unconscious intimacy that he had never allowed himself to express, but could no longer completely suppress. The possessiveness that had always simmered beneath their friendship began manifesting in subtle territorial behaviors, protective gestures, proprietary comments about their shared experiences, references to their long history that emphasized the depth of their connection in ways that excluded David from their inner circle. After David left, Lily's excited postmortem about his visit revealed that she had noticed nothing unusual about Ethan's behavior, interpreting his increased attention as normal social courtesy rather than evidence of romantic crisis. Her innocent observations about how well her two favorite men had gotten along, her pleasure in their apparent mutual respect, her satisfaction with the success of their domestic gathering, it all demonstrated the complete blindness that allowed her to remain, unaware of the emotional war being waged for her attention, but the cracks in Ethan's armor, once opened, proved impossible to completely seal. Daily interactions that had previously been manageable within the boundaries of friendship began carrying undertones that tested his ability to maintain appropriate distance. When Lily asked his opinion about outfits for her dates with David, Ethan found himself studying her with an intensity that made his throat dry and his pulse race, analyzing how different clothing emphasized her natural beauty while pretending to offer casual fashion advice. His protective instincts, always carefully contained within the acceptable parameters of platonic concern, began manifesting more obviously when David's name entered their conversations. Questions about David's intentions, observations about the pace of their developing relationship, subtle warnings about the complexities of workplace, romance, all delivered with the kind of careful neutrality that barely concealed his true feelings but apparently remained invisible to Lily's trusting perception. Most dangerous were the moments when she sought comfort during the inevitable uncertainties that accompanied new romantic territory. David's occasional unavailability due to artistic commitments, her confusion about interpreting his mixed signals, her natural anxiety about opening her heart to someone after months of comfortable solitude. These conversations required Ethan to provide supportive guidance while suppressing every instinct that screamed for him to declare his own feelings and eliminate her uncertainty through the simple expedient of honesty. Instead, he found himself walking an increasingly precarious tightrope, offering advice that served her best interests while slowly dying inside from the effort of encouraging her relationship with another man. His careful questions about her happiness, his gentle probing about David's worthiness, his subtle suggestions that she deserved someone who would prioritize her above all other considerations. It all carried the desperate subtext of someone trying to determine whether she might be available for alternative romantic arrangements without directly admitting his own availability. The breaking point arrived during a December evening when Lily returned from a date with David in obvious emotional distress. Her usual post-evening glow replaced by confusion and disappointment that she couldn't quite articulate. She had expected him to be more definitive about their relationship status, had hoped for clearer signals about his long-term intentions, had wanted reassurance that their growing intimacy was progressing toward something meaningful rather than remaining casual and undefined. Ethan listened to her concerns with the focused attention of someone hearing an opportunity disguised as crisis, his mind racing through possibilities that had nothing to do with David's emotional availability and everything to do with his own decade of certainty about wanting to build a life with her. Her vulnerability in that moment, her obvious need for the kind of security that came from being genuinely cherished, her unconscious appeal for the devotion he had been offering silently for years, it all combined to push him closer to the edge of honesty than he had ever allowed himself to venture. Even stone walls crumble when the heart beats loud enough. The decision to stop hiding came to Ethan during a January morning when he found Lily in their kitchen, staring at her phone with the kind of frustrated confusion that suggested David had once again failed to meet her expectations for consistency and emotional availability. She looked up when Ethan entered, her expression carrying the weary disappointment of someone beginning to question whether her romantic investment was being reciprocated with appropriate seriousness. For the first time in 10 years, instead of offering neutral support and encouraging patience, Ethan allowed himself to really look at her. Not with the carefully controlled glances he had perfected, but with the full intensity of his devotion visible in his expression. He watched her register the change in his attention, saw her eyes widen slightly as she encountered something in his gaze that transcended their established friendship boundaries, witnessed the moment when familiar comfort shifted into awareness of possibilities she had never previously considered. He moved closer to where she sat at their breakfast table, close enough that she could see the warmth in his eyes, close enough that his voice would carry the kind of intimate quality he had never allowed himself to use in their conversations. When he asked if she was all right, the question carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with casual concern and everything to do with his desire to be the person who ensured her happiness, her security, her complete emotional satisfaction. Her response was hesitant, uncertain, as if she was suddenly aware that their interaction had shifted into territory they had never explored together. But instead of retreating into safer conversational patterns, Ethan found himself leaning forward to brush a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek for just a moment longer than friendly gesture required. The touch was electric, transformative, sending heat racing through his nervous system while her sharp intake of breath suggested she felt the change in their dynamic as acutely as he did. The flirtation that began that morning was subtle at first, disguised as enhanced attention to her comfort and well-being that could still be interpreted as devoted friendship by someone determined to maintain safe boundaries. Ethan started leaving thoughtful notes with her morning coffee, observations about her beauty or intelligence that walked the line between friendly admiration and romantic appreciation. He began finding reasons for casual physical contact, steadying hands on her shoulders, guidance through doorways that required his palm against the small of her back, gestures that lasted just long enough to register as deliberately intimate. His compliments became more frequent and specific, focused on details that revealed the depth of his attention to everything about her. The way sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the grace of her movements when she cooked, the warmth in her voice when she spoke about her students. He allowed himself to voice appreciations he had been harboring silently for years, delivered with the kind of focused intensity that made her blush and look away as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time. But most effective was the way he began listening to her with the complete attention of someone whose happiness depended entirely on understanding her thoughts, her feelings, her dreams and concerns and daily experiences. When she talked about David's inconsistencies, Ethan offered not just sympathetic ear, but the kind of insight that came from truly knowing her. Observations about what she deserved, gentle questions about whether David's behavior aligned with her long-term relationship goals, subtle suggestions that she was worthy of someone who would never leave her questioning their commitment. Their evening conversations became longer, more intimate, as Ethan allowed himself to share thoughts and feelings he had previously kept carefully contained within friendship boundaries. He spoke about his own relationship experiences with new honesty, describing the way he had never felt genuine connection with other women because they lacked the qualities that made Lily extraordinary. He discussed his business successes in terms of wanting to build something worthy of sharing with someone special, his future plans always including references to partnership and shared dreams that invited her to imagine herself as part of his long-term vision. The transformation in their domestic routines was subtle but unmistakable. Ethan began initiating more physical contact, helping with dishes in ways that required standing close together. Movie nights where he positioned himself on their couch in ways that invited her to curl against his side. Morning conversations where he found excuses to touch her hand or brush imaginary lint from her sweater. Each gesture carried the weight of 10 years' worth of suppressed longing, and her increasingly frequent blushes suggested she was beginning to recognize the romantic subtext he was no longer trying to completely conceal. Most dangerous was the way he began speaking her name, allowing it to carry the warmth and tenderness he had always felt but never expressed. Lily became not just identification, but endearment, pronounced with the kind of reverent affection that transformed ordinary conversation into love letters delivered through daily interaction. He watched her respond to the change in his voice, saw her eyes soften when he said her name with particular gentleness, witnessed the way she had begun, unconsciously leaning toward him when they talked as if drawn. By some magnetic force she couldn't quite identify, the evening David canceled their Valentine's Day plans due to a last-minute artistic opportunity in Philadelphia. Ethan seized the moment to offer himself as substitute companion, not for a romantic dinner, but for the kind of evening he knew she would find more meaningful than conventional romantic gestures. He suggested they cook together, something elaborate and time-consuming that would require collaboration and create the kind of shared experience she valued above expensive restaurants or typical celebration rituals. They prepared ossobuco with risotto Milanese, a complex meal that demanded hours of attention and coordination. Working side by side in their kitchen while snow fell outside their windows and jazz played softly from the speakers he had installed as a housewarming surprise months earlier. The cooking process required constant consultation, shared tasting, gentle guidance when she struggled with timing or technique, and Ethan used every moment of collaboration as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of partnership he could offer: attentive, supportive, absolutely focused on her happiness and success. When she laughed at their flower-covered clothes and wine-flushed faces, when she declared the evening more enjoyable than any restaurant experience could have been, when she spontaneously hugged him with gratitude that lingered just long enough to feel like something more than friendly appreciation, Ethan felt the first real hope that maybe, possibly, she was beginning to see him as something other than the safe harbor of friendship she had always taken for granted. Could she really remain blind to the storm in his every gesture? The shift in Lily's awareness began as a subtle discomfort, a nagging sense that something fundamental had changed in the comfortable dynamics of her relationship with Ethan, without her conscious recognition of when or how the transformation had occurred. She found herself paying attention to details that had previously existed below the threshold of conscious observation. The way his voice softened when he spoke directly to her, the frequency with which he found reasons for casual physical contact, the intensity of his attention when she shared thoughts or concerns that she had never questioned, him focusing on with such concentrated interest. The realization crystallized during a February evening when David called to cancel yet another planned date, citing artistic deadlines that seemed to arise with suspicious frequency whenever they were supposed to spend time together. Lily hung up the phone with familiar frustration, her disappointment more about the pattern of inconsistency than the specific cancellation, and looked up to find Ethan watching her with an expression of such tender concern that it took her breath away. He didn't offer his usual neutral sympathy or gentle encouragement about David's competing priorities. Instead, he moved to where she stood in their living room and simply held her, his arms wrapping around her with the kind of protective warmth that felt like coming home after a long journey through uncertain territory. The embrace lasted longer than any hug they had shared in 10 years of friendship, and when she finally pulled back to look at his face, something in his eyes made her pulse quicken with recognition of feelings she had never allowed herself to examine. How long had he been looking at her like that? How many moments of tenderness had she missed while focusing on men who treated her with casual interest, rather than the devoted attention that had been available in her own home every single day? The questions began surfacing with increasing frequency as she started noticing things that had apparently been visible for months. The way Ethan's entire demeanor brightened when she entered a room, the careful attention he paid to her preferences when making decisions that affected their shared living space, the protective instincts that flared whenever she mentioned difficulties with David or challenges at work, the thoughtful notes he left with her morning coffee, which she had interpreted as simple kindness, suddenly revealed themselves as love letters disguised as friendly gestures, the way he listened to her stories about difficult students or administrative challenges, giving her his complete attention as if every detail of her professional life mattered deeply to him, began to feel less like friendship and more like the devotion of someone whose happiness was inextricably linked to her own well-being. Most revelatory was her growing awareness of how safe she felt in his presence, how naturally she had begun turning to him for comfort, advice, and the kind of emotional support that she had never expected from David despite months of romantic involvement. Ethan knew her teaching schedule, remembered her students' names, anticipated her moods and needs with an intuitive understanding that felt both miraculous and somehow inevitable, given their years of shared history. The evening she found herself comparing David's sporadic text messages to Ethan's consistent presence, his casual interest to Ethan's obvious investment in every aspect of her daily life. Something fundamental shifted in her perception of what love actually looked like when it was genuine, rather than performed for temporary attraction. She began watching Ethan with new awareness, studying his face during their dinner conversations, paying attention to the way his eyes followed her movements around their kitchen, noticing how his entire posture relaxed when she settled beside him on their couch for their evening reading ritual. The man she had taken for granted as her dearest friend revealed himself to be someone who had been loving her quietly, completely, with the kind of steadfast devotion she had been seeking, in all the wrong places. The revelation was both thrilling and terrifying because it required her to reevaluate everything she thought she understood about their relationship. Had she been blind to his feelings, or had he been hiding them so skillfully that even someone who knew him as well as she did couldn't recognize them? More importantly, how did she feel about the possibility that her best friend, the person she trusted more than anyone else in the world, might be in love with her in ways that could transform their entire dynamic? The answer came during a March morning, when she woke to find fresh flowers on their breakfast table. Not the casual grocery store bouquet that David occasionally brought, but carefully chosen blooms that reflected her favorite colors and scents. Ethan was already dressed for work, pouring coffee into her favorite mug, and when he turned to greet her, his smile carried such warmth and tenderness that her heart began racing with recognition of feelings she had been suppressing without realizing it. She was falling in love with him. Had been falling in love with him, perhaps, for months or even years without acknowledging what was happening, because she had categorized him as safe, unavailable, permanently fixed in the role of devoted friend who would never complicate their relationship with romantic expectations. But standing in their kitchen, watching him move through their shared morning routine with the graceful consideration that had become second nature after months of cohabitation, Lily realized that she couldn't imagine her life without him. Not just as a friend, not just as a roommate, but as the person she wanted to wake up beside every morning, to share dreams and disappointments with, to build a future with that honored both their individual ambitions and their growing connection. The thought of David, of continuing a relationship that felt shallow compared to what she shared with Ethan, became suddenly unbearable. How had she convinced herself that sporadic attention and surface-level compatibility were adequate substitutes for the deep understanding and consistent devotion that had been available to her all along? When Ethan asked if she was all right, his voice carrying the gentle concern that had become his default tone when speaking to her, Lily found herself really looking at him, not as her safe harbor friend, but as the man who had been quietly, patiently waiting for her to recognize what had been growing between them, despite her romantic pursuits elsewhere. The way he said her name, with a tenderness that made it sound like poetry, the careful attention he paid to her emotional state, the obvious way her happiness affected his own mood and energy, it all pointed toward a love that had been steady and available while she had been chasing relationships that offered excitement, but no real foundation for lasting partnership. Sometimes love doesn't arrive. It has been standing beside you all along. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Thursday evening in late March, bringing with it the kind of weather that transformed their cozy townhouse into a sanctuary against the chaos outside. Rain lashed against their windows with increasing intensity, while wind howled through the maple trees that lined their street. And the electricity flickered ominously as Lily and Ethan settled into their evening routine with the heightened awareness that comes from being safely contained while nature demonstrates its power. Lily had ended her relationship with David that afternoon, a conversation that had been surprisingly easy once she acknowledged that she had been trying to force feelings that simply didn't exist in sufficient depth to justify continued investment. David had accepted her decision with gracious understanding, admitting that he too had sensed her emotional distance and had been questioning whether their connection was substantial enough to pursue more seriously. The relief she felt after finally acknowledging what had become obvious over recent weeks, that David represented a distraction from, rather than a path, toward genuine happiness, was so profound that she found herself humming while she prepared their dinner, her mood lighter than it had been in months despite the violent weather outside. Ethan seemed to sense the shift in her emotional state, his own energy more relaxed and genuinely cheerful than she had seen since David's appearance in their lives had introduced tension neither of them had directly acknowledged. They moved through their dinner preparation with the synchronized ease that had developed over months of shared domestic routines. But tonight their collaboration carried an undercurrent of anticipation that felt both thrilling and slightly dangerous. The power failed completely just as they were finishing their meal, plunging their townhouse into darkness that was broken only by the lightning that illuminated their dining room in dramatic flashes. Ethan retrieved candles from their emergency supplies, transforming their ordinary evening into something that felt intimate and slightly magical, the flickering light casting dancing shadows that made even familiar surroundings feel transformed and full of possibility. The moment that shattered their careful boundaries arrived when Lily's phone rang with David's contact information displayed on the screen. His call presumably intended to continue their afternoon conversation, or perhaps to attempt reconciliation, despite their mutual acknowledgement that their relationship lacked necessary foundation. She stared at the ringing device with no intention of answering. But something in Ethan's expression as he watched her ignore the call made her pulse quicken, with sudden awareness of how her romantic choices affected him. When the ringing stopped and silence returned to their candlelit living room, Ethan looked at her with such intensity that she felt her breath catch in her throat. The careful mask he had worn for months, perhaps years, had slipped completely, revealing something raw and vulnerable and absolutely devastating in its honesty. He didn't speak, didn't need to speak, because everything was visible in his face. The love he had been hiding, the jealousy he had endured, the hope that was battling with fear as he recognized that this moment might represent either the beginning of everything he had wanted, or the end of the friendship that had anchored his entire adult life. She reached toward him without conscious decision, her hand finding his face in the flickering candlelight, her thumb tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone as she studied features that had become so familiar she had stopped really seeing them. But now she saw everything. The way his eyes darkened when she touched him, the slight tremor in his breathing that suggested he was fighting for control, the complete stillness that indicated he was afraid to move or speak, lest he break whatever spell was allowing this moment to exist. The confession came not through words, but through the way she leaned toward him, closing the space between them with deliberate slowness that gave him time to understand her intention, to recognize that she was choosing him not as a consolation prize or rebound distraction, but as the answer to questions she had been asking in all the wrong places. When she rested her forehead against his, when her fingers tangled in his hair with the kind of tenderness that could only come from genuine feeling. Ethan's careful emotional control finally cracked completely. His hands found her face with desperate reverence, framing her features as if he was trying to memorize every detail, his eyes searching hers for confirmation that this was real, that she was choosing him with full awareness of what that choice meant for both of their lives. The intensity of his gaze, the way his breathing had become shallow and quick, the obvious effort it took for him to remain, still when every instinct was probably screaming at him to close the distance between them. It all testified to years of suppressed longing finally being acknowledged. The thunder that crashed overhead at that precise moment seemed to underscore the significance of their silent communication, nature providing dramatic emphasis for the moment when 10 years of careful friendship transformed into something that would either elevate them both or destroy the foundation of their shared existence. But as Lily looked into Ethan's eyes, as she saw her own growing feelings reflected in his expression, she felt no fear, only the profound rightness of finally recognizing what had been building between them, despite her romantic pursuits elsewhere. When she whispered his name, just his name, with all the tenderness and recognition and promise she could convey in those 2 syllables, Ethan closed his eyes as if the sound caused him physical pain and perfect pleasure combined. His hands trembled against her face, his entire body radiating the kind of tension that came from wanting something desperately while being afraid to believe it was actually possible. The storm raged around their candlelit sanctuary, but inside their living room, in the space between their heartbeats and barely controlled breathing, the only sound was the whispered acknowledgement of feelings that had been years in the making and could no longer be contained within the safe boundaries of friendship. When love speaks without words, can the heart do anything but listen? The morning after the storm broke in more ways than one, Lily woke in her own bed with the crystalline awareness that everything had changed irrevocably between her and Ethan, though they had parted the previous evening with nothing more than lingering touches and promises whispered in candlelight. The electricity had returned sometime during the night, but she found herself preferring the gentle morning light that filtered through her bedroom curtains, illuminating a world that felt fundamentally transformed by honesty finally acknowledged. The scent of coffee and something delicate, pancakes, perhaps, or French toast, drew her from her room to discover Ethan in their kitchen, moving with the focused attention of someone preparing something special. He had changed from his usual business attire into casual clothes that made him look younger, more approachable, and when he turned to greet her, his smile carried such warmth and nervous hope that her heart began racing with the same intensity she had felt during their candlelit revelation. They moved through breakfast preparation with a new kind of awareness, every casual touch now charged with significance, every shared glance carrying the weight of feelings that were no longer hidden but not yet fully explored. The easy domesticity they had perfected over months of cohabitation had acquired layers of intimacy that made even ordinary tasks feel like courtship rituals, and Lily found herself mesmerized by details she had never consciously noticed. The grace of Ethan's movements, the way he anticipated her needs without being asked, the obvious pleasure he took in caring for her comfort. The conversation that would define their future began tentatively, with careful acknowledgments of what had shifted between them, and gentle explorations of what they both wanted their relationship to become. Ethan spoke with the hesitant honesty of someone who had guarded his feelings for so long that expressing them felt both liberating and terrifying. His words chosen with the precision of someone who understood that this conversation would determine whether they built something beautiful together or lost everything they had already created. He told her about falling in love with her during their senior year of high school, about spending a decade learning to hide his feelings so skillfully that even he sometimes forgot their intensity, until moments like watching her with David reminded him of everything he stood to lose. He described the exquisite torture of living with her, of witnessing her daily routines and private moments while maintaining the facade of platonic friendship, of supporting her through relationships with other men, while dying inside from the effort of encouraging her happiness with people who would never love her as completely as he did. His confession was raw, vulnerable, and absolutely devastating in its sincerity. He had built his professional success largely as a way to become worthy of her attention, had chosen their shared living arrangement not for practical reasons but because proximity to her felt like the closest thing to happiness he could achieve without risking the friendship that had become essential to his emotional survival. Every decision, every achievement, every moment of his adult life had been influenced by his love for her, whether she realized it or not. But most importantly, he told her about his fear, the terror that had kept him silent for 10 years, the certainty that revealing his feelings would destroy the most precious relationship in his life if she couldn't reciprocate his romantic attachment. Losing her friendship would have been worse than any business failure or personal disappointment, so he had chosen the safety of hidden love over the risk of honest rejection. David's appearance in her life had forced his hand, Ethan admitted, because watching her explore romantic possibilities with someone else while remaining oblivious to his decade of devotion had become unbearable. The jealousy, the protective instincts, the desperate need to demonstrate that he could offer her everything David promised and more. It had all conspired to crack the emotional armor he had spent years perfecting, revealing feelings that could no longer be contained within friendship boundaries. Lily listened to his confession with tears she didn't bother to hide, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously as she realized the depth of love that had been quietly supporting her through every challenge and celebration of their shared adult lives. The man she had taken for granted as her dearest friend, her safest harbor, her most trusted advisor. He had been in love with her all along, building his entire existence around her happiness while expecting nothing in return beyond the privilege of remaining in her life. Her response came not through elaborate declarations, but through the simple act of reaching for his hands, intertwining their fingers with the kind of deliberate tenderness that announced her choice more clearly than any verbal confession could have accomplished. She told him that she loved him too, that she had been falling in love with him for months, without recognizing what was happening, because she had never imagined that safety and passion could exist in the same person, that the man who made her feel most secure could also make her heart race with anticipation and desire. She had been looking for love in all the wrong places, she realized, pursuing relationships that offered excitement, but no real foundation, while the person who understood her completely, who supported her dreams and celebrated her victories, who made her laugh and feel cherished and absolutely secure. He had been waiting patiently for her to recognize what had been growing between them all along. The months that followed were a revelation in themselves, as friendship transformed into courtship with the kind of natural progression that felt both inevitable and miraculous. Ethan courted her with the focused attention of someone making up for lost time, bringing her flowers that reflected her changing moods, planning dates that honored her interests while creating new shared experiences, demonstrating through countless small gestures that she was precious beyond measure to someone who had been studying her happiness for 10 years. Their first official date was dinner at the restaurant where they had celebrated his college graduation. But now every shared meal felt like celebration, because they could finally acknowledge what had always been true, that they belonged together not just as friends, but as partners in every sense that mattered. When he looked at her across candlelit tables, when he spoke her name with the reverent tenderness that had always been there, but was no longer hidden, Lily felt her heart expand with happiness so complete it sometimes overwhelmed her with its intensity. The proposal came 6 months later, on a December evening when they were decorating their townhouse for Christmas, transforming their shared space into something that looked like the home they had always been building together without realizing it. They had been hanging lights around their living room windows when Ethan suddenly went still, his hands full of twinkling decorations, his expression carrying the kind of nervous determination that preceded life-changing moments. He set down the lights and reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box that made Lily's breath catch in recognition of what was about to happen. When he knelt in their living room, surrounded by half-finished Christmas decorations and the warm glow of their domestic happiness, his proposal was everything she had never known she wanted. Not flowery romantic poetry, but honest words about building a life together that honored both their individual dreams and their shared commitment to creating something beautiful from the love that had survived hiding, uncertainty, and the test of time itself. He wanted to wake up beside her every morning, he said, his voice trembling with emotion he no longer needed to conceal. He wanted to support her through challenges and celebrate her successes, to be the person she turned to for comfort, advice, and the kind of partnership that made both of them better than they could be alone. But mostly, he wanted to love her openly, completely, with the kind of devotion he had been offering secretly for 10 years, finally free from the fear that honesty would cost him everything he valued most in the world. The ring was perfect in its simplicity, elegant, timeless, chosen with the careful attention to her preferences that characterized every gesture he made in service of her happiness. But more perfect was the way his hand shook as he slipped it onto her finger, the way his eyes filled with tears when she whispered yes, the way he held her afterward as if she might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly. Her acceptance was immediate, accompanied by laughter and tears that carried all the joy she felt at finally, understanding that the greatest love story of her life had been unfolding. In the most ordinary moments, shared meals and quiet conversations, morning coffee and evening reading, the steady presence of someone who had chosen her above all other possibilities before she even knew she was available to be chosen. They were married the following spring in their own backyard, Surrounded by friends and family who had watched their friendship evolve into something that looked exactly like the kind of love people wrote songs about, Lily wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit perfectly, and carried wildflowers that Ethan had picked that morning from the garden they had planted together. When they exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to love each other through all seasons and changes, their words carried across spring air that seemed to bless unions built on foundations strong enough to support forever. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, moving slowly to music that played softly from speakers they had strung in the maple trees, Lily looked up at Ethan's face and saw her entire future reflected in his eyes. This was what love looked like when it was real. The steady warmth of someone who had waited patiently for her to recognize what had been true all along. In his arms, surrounded by celebration and the scent of blooming flowers, she understood that some love stories didn't begin with grand gestures or instant attraction. The most profound connections grew slowly, quietly, nurtured by daily kindness and the patient faith that real love, when it was genuine and meant to last, would always find its way to recognition. And as they swayed together in their garden, surrounded by everyone who mattered most to them, Ethan whispered against her ear that he had known since high school she was the one, had built his entire adult life around the hope that someday she would see him as more than just her dearest friend. And now that someday had become forever, and forever had never looked so beautiful as it did in her eyes.